Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the January 17th, 2017 work session meeting of the Methacton School Board. If you'd rise for the pledge, please.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, in terms of announcements, the public is hereby advised of the audio and video recording of this meeting for the purpose of rebroadcasting. For attendance, all members of the Methacton School Board are in attendance with the exception of Mr. Boardman and Mr. Phillips. And recognition of guests and scheduled speakers, Dr. Zerbe, we do have two presentations this evening, one on transportation and one on the 2017-2018 proposed preliminary budget. Dr. Zerbe.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. As indicated, there are two presentations. Because there's likely to be questions on both of these presentations as part of our working session this evening, we'll ask the board to take seats in the first row. Then we'll come back to the seats if there's an indication that there are questions from the board. If in your seats there are no questions, we will then proceed to the second presentation. But to give the opportunity for you to speak, I'd ask you first to see the first presentation, Dr. Harney, on transportation presentation. And please have your seat in the front row.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'll be presenting the proposed operational and organizational structure for the Methacton Transportation Department. On this slide, we'll discuss the areas of need and the decisions that needed to be made. We began by working with looking at both our routing software and our routing services. As far as the software, our needs were to find a vendor that could provide a user-friendly system, one that has strong support capabilities, one with reasonable cost for both initial setup and annual maintenance, and one that is technologically relevant and on par with the latest advancements. The decisions that needed to be made in this area would be, would we remain with our current system or change to a new vendor? When we looked at the routing services, our focus was on our need for an initial review and a need for a route improvement project that we foresee as a need after that review. Additionally, we have the annual need of our student data rollover. This entails moving students from one grade to the next, adding summer enrollments, kindergartners, etc. We also need periodic reviews of efficiency and continuity, making sure that the small changes made on a daily basis are not grossly affecting the efficiency. And finally, we have our daily needs that incorporate move-ins and changes suggested by staff, parents, and our drivers. The decisions that needed to be made here are who will we choose and for what portion of our needs and what will the cost be. Last but not least, we reviewed systems of departmental oversight. We reviewed our needs for systems and processes to manage and oversee the transportation department. Our decisions involved a review of the potential personnel who would be doing the oversight and the structure of all the duties and responsibilities needed to effectively oversee the entire department. And certainly not least of which we needed to do a thorough cost evaluation and the effect the oversight function would have on our budget. First, we will discuss routing software. Presentations were held on December 20th, 2016 for both routing services and software. The evaluators were district staff, which included myself, Troy Sisnovic, Aaron Roberts, principal at Arrowhead Elementary, Deanie Ryan Washington, a special education supervisor, our first student site manager, Amy Huffman, and external transportation experts we brought in from the IU, who included Jerry Ranking and Donna D'Amelio. 4 systems were presented and evaluated. We looked at Edulog, Versatrans, TransFinder, and our current system, BusBoss. The criteria evaluated were the vendor's initial implementation plans, their training and support capacity, their reporting capabilities, their mapping quality, their abilities to pre-assign attendance zones and stop restrictions, and their interoperability with a variety of student information systems. Out of that process, 2 finalists were discussed. That was TransFinder and BusBoss by Orbit Software. And finally, BusBoss was the selected product. And our rationale focused on the fact that their system functions were comparable to the other systems, including TransFinder. Additionally, we found that BusBoss has a great deal more to offer technologically than we were currently utilizing. We then looked at cost efficiencies and the fact that we already own BusBoss, and the cost for year 1 implementation was substantially lower due to the fact that we already own the software, and the only additional costs were our annual maintenance costs. And moving forward, BusBoss was also slightly less on an annual basis to maintain the maintenance cost than was TransFinder. And we looked at the training options and corporate location. Being that BusBoss built in much more on-site versus online training into their proposal, and that they're located in Pottstown, both of these were viewed and seen as a positive. Now moving on to our routing services evaluations. The criteria utilized for this evaluation were the detail of the initial transition plans presented, the size and the availability of the routing support team, the annual benchmarks set forth in their proposed timelines, the vendor's experience with public schools, specifically local school districts, their abilities in the student notification systems, and their plans for utilizing local, meaning district and first student input. Orbit Software, the creators of BusBoss, were selected for the major routing needs for the following reasons. Orbit's project parameters and annual tasks were highly detailed and included their initial analysis, their route creation, and the final route deliverables for the 17-18 school year. They also provided plans for an annual data rollover and new student uploads. Additionally, we saw substantial advantages in their local knowledge and history with the district. First Student was selected as to manage our daily routing needs for the following reasons. Our daily routing needs are such things as new student additions, as well as modifications suggested by our drivers, dispatchers, and district personnel and administrators. Continuing to utilize First Student makes the most sense, as they are the local experts and have the intimate knowledge of our daily operational needs. Departmental Oversight was the other vital operational need reviewed. Options we considered were to use the model we've had in the past, being a district-employed transportation manager, or to look for options for a third party to oversee the operations. Several options were considered and proposals presented for the third-party option. First was Transpar. They're a national company with a division called School Bus Consultants that exclusively does transportation management and consulting services, and we reviewed a proposal submitted by the Montgomery County IU Transportation Department to provide our oversight function. The Montgomery County IU was ultimately selected for the following reasons. Their ability to provide a team of support, including several individuals with vast amount of transportation knowledge, as well as having access to additional secretarial support as needed. They also bring with them a great deal of local knowledge and are located very close to the district here in the county. We also have a long-standing transportation relationship with them, as they have been contracted to support our specialized transportation needs in the area of special education. We also found some cost efficiencies in this decision compared to both the other vendor that we reviewed, as well as employing our own transportation manager. The major duties of the Montgomery County IU will be as follows. They will be the liaison between the district and our contracted transportation provider. They will be the liaison between the district and our software and routing services vendor, which are one and the same, that being Orbit. They will do monthly reviews of invoices. They will assist with state reporting. They will provide administrative support and provide guidance and oversight on transportation issues that may arise on a daily basis in conjunction with First Student. They will provide audit support when needed with district and state auditors. They will also perform occasional audits of routes to assure consistency and efficiency. And along with First Student, they will have the capability to make minor routing changes, as they will be the department supervisors on a daily basis. They will also provide on-site presence several days a week as needed. So what are the next steps? A meeting is being established between all parties to review the operational structures. Once the plan is board approved, the following will begin to take place immediately. Contracts will be finalized with all vendors and reviewed by our solicitor. Initial project duties will be assigned and timelines set. The IU will take over as the project manager. Orbit will begin its preliminary research and field work. In the late winter, early spring, and into early summer, analysis reports will be completed. Draft routes will be created and tested. Student data will be rolled over to the 17-18, we're in the 17-18, the 18-19 school year, and adjustments made as needed. And runs will be tested, and a final product will be completed well in advance of the 18-19 school year. No, I'm right, 17-18 school year. I apologize. This next slide outlines the annual cost analysis and also the analysis of our costs going beyond year one. As you can see, the routing software is consistent for the first 2 years. Those are strictly our maintenance fees. We already own BusBoss, so those are just the annual maintenance fees that are built into our yearly budget. You'll see the routing services by Orbit at $39,800 for the first year, and that's the initial analysis and route creation to set up for the new school year. And going forward, that $8,100 is the dollar figure that we were quoted as. They'll utilize that on a yearly basis to roll over the students, make the adjustments as we roll into every new school year. And the daily routing services by first student, you'll see what we were quoted there as an annual cost. And the Department Oversight at the MCIU, you can see their annual quote there. All those are annual calculation costs that will be prorated, obviously, for this year, except for the initial routing, which should be completed by year's end. So the routing services by Orbit, that $39,800, will not be prorated. That is what we're estimating will be the cost this year to get ready for next year. And that completes my presentation. Are there any questions? You want to?
Other questions from the board at this moment in time? If so, I'll take it to the second.
In terms of questions, do we want to start down with Mr. Roth? Do you have any questions? Work our way down this way.
Yeah, for the MCIU, pretty obvious that they have their, local knowledge, location, stuff like that. Thanks. As far as the MCIU, are they running managing any other systems right now?
They are not. This is their first time offering this. They actually approached us with this idea when they learned of our circumstance, and they created the scenario of which we started to consider this option as a third-party option and allowing their team to manage our transportation needs. They're looking to, in the meeting that we had with myself and Dr. Zerby and their team, they're looking to hire somebody internally to cover some of the things that they do now, and then we'll have the time to devote their team to some of the work that is going to need to be done here.
One of the things that was always good in having somebody from the district involved was having, for lack of a better term, an owner's rep, involved with this. Will we have that connection still with the MCIU still running? I know we're having obviously a contact person, but I guess as far as who's going to be the Methacton side of this?
The IU, they are our owner's rep. They are doing the work for us, contracted with us to manage that department. So they will be our eyes, ears, and workforce. They are our representatives.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harney. A couple of quick questions. To follow up on Herb's question on the IU, is it I understand that they're really an extension of the school district from the principal perspective, but is there other IUs providing services besides, obviously, ours is not, but is Bucksmont, Delaware County, et cetera?
Do other IUs offer that service?
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know. We received the proposal and really were only considering MCIU. I did not reach out to other IUs to see if they had a competitive situation or that they could work with us. And really because of the fact that we were looking for that local connection. And that was really one of the big enticements. So we really didn't look elsewhere as far as other IUs.
Okay. It wasn't so much to go to a different IU or be competitive IU, it's just to understand if they're trailblazing or if they can learn from each other and so forth. So I would, at some point, would like to just at least understand that, not to hold up the conversation. But was there any, when you evaluated the software, when we were evaluating the possibility of putting a new information system in, was there a preference or a connection point, or why don't we have this connection point with BusBoss? What was going to improve from that perspective?
We realized a lot after the presentation with BusBoss that we didn't realize before with BusBoss, but one thing I realized after all the presentations is a lot of it was on maybe our end of the student information system versus what the other companies can do. All the other companies had a list of all the information, student information systems they work with. And our student information system, I think, was, not being a technology expert, it seemed to me, coming out of those presentations and then figuring out what happened before, it was more on our end, on our information system, than it was necessarily their capabilities. But BusBoss had the same capabilities as far as talking to student information systems as did the other software vendors. And really, the only other one that we really considered hard was TransFinder.
So, all right, I'll keep one comment to myself related to that. Were there any concerns of the parents or the community that were involved that are not being addressed in the process?
Not that I recall from our committee standpoint. I brought them back into the process when we started to look at what we were doing. I've had conversations with committee members. I've had conversations after our meeting with committee members, and I believe all their concerns were addressed through that process. I did reach out, and we did get somebody from the private school side. We have a parent now that's on the committee for that and expanded the committee, but I don't recall any other parent issues or anybody on my committee that raised a concern that wasn't addressed.
Okay. And the Pottstown, obviously the local. Can you just explain to me what the Orbit software, when we talk about the routing services, what that means? So you have the BusBoss, but what is the Orbit software?
Orbit software is the company. Their product is BusBoss. And a lot of the routing companies that produce software, such as TransFinder, such as Versatrans, Edgelog, they also all do routing services. So they produce a product, and using their product, they will provide you the service of routing your school district as well.
Okay. All right. And you mentioned that also that we use the IU for contracted special education services. Can you just explain what that means today, what the IU is providing?
The IU contracts with several other private providers for specialized services. We have students with special needs that go beyond our capabilities with our buses, and those specialized needs are run through the IU, and they find private contractors that can handle those for us, so they take care of that piece. It's not a lot of students, but it's an annual need that we have.
Okay. And then, thank you. And the last question, I guess, for Dr. Zerbe and maybe Dr. Harney is to Herb's point related to, who in-house has ownership over this? And is it business services role? Is it through Dr. Harney temporarily, or is it going to be through you? Who is managing it from a factor perspective? That I don't need an answer now, but unless you have a comment.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, primarily transportation typically falls under the business services department, but as you know, we have a new business manager, and we had a need to start this process, and Dr. Harney was volunteered to start the process for us, and he'll likely carry it through and then hand that off as we become more familiar with how things will work long term. But I see this back in the business office at some point.
As do I. He says, hopefully.
Thank you, Dr. Harney. So for starters, I'm trying to make sure that I understand the thought process that went into figuring out these areas of need and decision points. Is this something that grew out of the transportation committee that was formed?
Actually, they were just the big bucket items when we started to look at all of our needs. When we had a transportation manager, they were still the same bucket items, but they were contained pretty much within one person. So we did the oversight. They were to do all the routing and work with First Student on the daily updates. So there were the 3 bucket items that need to be done. So they weren't as much wants as needs, and how the job breaks out for us, and then things that we need to have a smooth transportation department.
Okay. One of the concerns that I have in looking at this is that we have a service that once upon a time was housed here, and then we outsourced, and now we're taking the outsourcing and further splintering it, and I have big concerns about compatibility and communication among all these different pieces. How are we going to address that? Because to me, the more pieces you have, the more connections you have, the more opportunity there is for a misstep. I think that we saw some of that this past fall. So how do we know that that's not going to happen here?
That's a very logical concern, and frankly, it's a concern that we all have as well. But when we looked at what options were available to us, we went through the process of trying to hire a transportation manager on several occasions, and there isn't a large pool out there. So we decided to see if there were other options to look at. It's going to be a very concerted effort to keep those 3 units together. We have a meeting scheduled already. So getting those parties together and letting them know they all have equal importance in getting this thing done. I know the IU understands that. I know that Bus Boss Orbit Software understands that at this point. I mean, they were involved with us on the other side when we had the other issues. So everyone involved knows that we're all in on this and that there's no room for error, and this year has to be vastly improved over last year. So I can't make any guarantees, but I can guarantee it's going to get its best shot, especially from me and everyone else that was involved, because there's no room for error this year. We cannot have another year like we had last year.
I think we all agree on that one.
Yeah, let me just add to that. Some of the things that, I believe that we have planned as Dr. Harney says, we are getting together with the 3 entities to iron out some of the finer details, but predominantly leveraging the software that we have is the key aspect of this. Secondly, leveraging our people and making sure that they're trained properly to utilize the software to its greatest extent. And then as you see, there's software, there's annual routing services, and then there's daily routing services. The annual routing services really has a stopping point. I mean, at some point, by agreement or contract, a product will need to be produced and it will be dropped off. And then that's where the daily routing processes and the confirmation of that work will take place, is similar to what we did this past year with working with our drivers and our First Student management. So there's a couple things that are certainly different than the past, based on our sheer recognition of a system that wasn't as functional and wasn't leveraged to its proper capacity, in addition to making sure that we have individuals trained properly in order to get that. Trained not only from the IU, trained also from First Student and from anyone else that will be having their hands associated with the system.
Yeah, Orbitz is committed to, that was one of the big reasons, they committed to a lot more training, in-person training, as well as a variety of training methods than any of the other vendors that we looked at as far as routing services. And to us, that's key. We need to get a good handful of people trained on that system.
And then as we get into the cost, I want to confirm a couple of things. So,
Sure.
Once we get into year 2 and beyond, obviously that, I believe, is less than what we had been paying for a transportation manager.
That is correct.
What about at year 1?
That's actually still a little bit less than all in on transportation manager.
Okay. And then the part of the daily routing services that we're paying to First Student, why is this not part of our contracted services with them?
Because our original contract was designed that our transportation manager would do all of the routing, so it was never built into their contract.
Okay. And do we have a timeline in place for when we're going to have certain deliverables from these different entities?
Yeah, clearly mapped out, and we can get those to you. That was, again, another reason I keep going back to it. But the proposals and the presentations were very important because, frankly, I wasn't sure we'd be going with Bus Boss again. I didn't know what we saw in the presentation and what we saw that they can do from a project standpoint was very impressive, and they laid out some very strong dates and deliverables that I believe are going to get us where we need to be, but they're all delineated by date in their proposal
Okay.
and will be in the contract.
And that leads me to my final question then. What length of a contract are we looking to enter into with these organizations?
We talked, the IU is going to be a fluid situation year by year because they see, as we do, that may not be constantly needed. The level of their involvement may diminish over time as we get more capacity in-house to be able to do some of those things. I believe the orbits, and I apologize that wasn't part of the presentation and I can't pull it out of my head. I'm thinking that the orbits was a one-year situation for the initial analysis and route creation, and we really didn't come to any years beyond that. I did focus on that year 2 and beyond. What will it look like on a yearly basis for them to roll over the students, make all the adjustments, and then deliver to us by the end of the school year, and that's that $8,100. But we really didn't, the contracts haven't been drawn yet, so we really haven't come to a number as far as years for that contract. And we didn't come to, none of these are in contract form yet, so we really didn't come to a year.
I think it's going to be, in situations like this, they're likely to be annual contracts with the options to renew based on performance. I mean, really, we're talking about not only protecting, having the individual protect themselves, but us protect ourselves as well. So I can't see it going. I don't think the prices that you've included here were contingent on multi-year agreements. These are annual dollars. So we would typically pay for the annual, let's say, software, that's $5,600. I don't. So that's something
just the annual maintenance fee,
regardless of whether we were with them for 4 years or 5 years or just 1 year.
I would strongly prefer that we just enter into this as a 1-year or year-to-year contract because we've had so many issues in the last few years with transportation.
Thank you, Dr. Harney, for the presentation. First question is, since the IU hasn't done this in the past, and this is kind of a new thing for them, do we know what their team will look like and what type of background or expertise they might have? Have they identified the specific individuals who we'll be working with?
They have, and I've seen both their resumes. I can get it out to the board. One has well over 20 years in transportation. The other has several years in transportation. We also have access to their secretarial pool in that department as well. So it's much more of a team approach, but I do have the names, and I can get you the names and the particulars on those individuals. They were included in their proposal.
That would be great. And that actually leads into one of the other questions I had. In terms of that additional secretarial offering, what would that entail? What does that look like?
It's really going to be anything that they need from their standpoint on a daily basis, answering phone calls, all of the things that they would get from that type of support that we would have had and did have in our district for many years. So it's just an ongoing secretarial support that anybody would have in any managerial position, but they have it on a daily basis that we did not have with our transportation director.
So in terms of another, bad scenario for the start of the school year, they would be the ones who could help us in handling the phone calls and the resolution of the different matters.
The workflow from those types of calls is going to be what it is now. First student handles the most of the day-to-day issues. When they're more intense, they come up here. Now when they're more intense and need a district contact person, the IU will take care of that. But then at some point there will obviously have to be a contact here for them to go to the next level if there's an issue. But the IU will be basically our transportation manager, so it's going to flow like it would through the transportation manager.
Okay. In terms of the Bus Boss software, it was mentioned that there were some things that we weren't utilizing. What specifically did you find that they offer that we weren't utilizing that you think can help solve some of the problems that we've had?
There were I guess, what do you call them, 2 dashboards that I know that Amy Hoffman had never seen before when it related to, first of all, there's a lot of student contact opportunities when they talk properly to the student information system, that we will hopefully have that relationship at some point when we have a student information system. All of the other things were around being able to set up predetermined specifics. You're not talking to, all the zones and all of the, but also to the other point is setting up all of the places we don't want stops, where we want right side pickup only. There was just a lot of things that we can build to it, and so we can auto-populate and then move from there, instead of a lot of the handwork that was being done now.
Okay. And those are all inclusive of the software? They're not a la carte items that you have to pay for certain parts here or there? They were always available, we just weren't necessarily utilizing them?
Yep. One of the things they talked about was whenever they make an enhancement, it just goes with the product. They don't charge extra for it. So they're constantly trying to revamp and enhance their product. And when that happens, it's just part of the product, and we don't pay for the extras.
Okay. And last question was, you mentioned that this was the IU, they also perform occasional internal audit of routes. What exactly does that look like? Is that upon our request? Is that just something that they would, yearly pick, a percentage of our routes to review, or what does that look like?
Well, actually, they talked about that at our meeting, and they would probably set up some dates, maybe 2, 3, 4 times a year, just to run reports and look at efficiency studies and do all those things on a regular basis. Because as you go through a school year and you start making onesies and twosies changes all over the place, it can affect the consistency and efficiency of the routes. So just to look at the original routes the way they were established, and then run reports against that with what's existing at that point to see if there's any real drop-off in efficiency.
All right. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you for kind of taking on the transportation world until it's handed off to Mr. Klaus.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Harney. I got a bunch of questions. On the second page, we talk about the processes. We're talking about the area of needs. Who's going to be responsible for developing the processes?
The team, in our initial meeting, we'll be all together. The team will first meet, but the project management is going to be the IU. So at some point where we're comfortable with what the team is setting forth to do, we're going to be turning over that project to the IU to manage that. So at this point, they're going to be setting those processes. I don't know, we haven't established when we're going to have follow-up meetings, but we're going to have occasional follow-up meetings so we can monitor what these processes are and make sure we're on board with them. But they are going to be the PM doing most of that groundwork as far as setting those up.
Is the school district or the team, I'm not sure, maybe it would help me identifying who the team is, but it seems like we had a little bit of the Keystone Cops game, in the past. How or who will assign metrics to the processes to make sure that we're identifying failure modes in advance of them happening? There's some analytics you can do about, failure modes and all that kind of stuff. And we need to kind of wrap some metrics around some things, because with all of the different people now that have touch points, I can see a lot of gray and accountability in question.
Initially, what our metrics are going to be and what our major stop points are going to be on the deliverable dates and progress reports with the deliverable dates. I don't have the expertise really to set anything beyond that in an advanced measurement system or metric system, except to monitor those deliverable dates, make sure that the project manager is staying on top of the vendors as far as delivering those deliverables on time. And if not, then we have to put processes in place to make sure that they get done, and if they don't get done, that there's methods for us to make the correction.
So as we work into the actual contract, whether it's Bus Boss or the IU or whatnot, I think it's going to be important at least to have some of those items very specifically a part of the contract before it's signed, right? Because once it's signed, you already have your dance partner. So you need to have kind of those metrics, at least the high-level metrics, and then some kind of language that says we'll mutually develop processes and metrics to evaluate the success of the processes along the way.
Okay.
So we got to be very careful with our contract to make sure that that's part of it. And I think there's probably some technology metrics about uptime and all that kind of stuff that Troy ought to weigh in as well. So it's both the operational side, but it's also the technology side, I would think. You talk about it on the routing software, but this is a broader question. If cost wasn't an issue, okay, because that was kind of part of the rationale on the routing software. If cost wasn't an issue, would you make the same selection and set up the same organizational structure as you're recommending?
I think we would, and I'm somewhat surprised to say that from where we started the process. And when I started to look, I made a million phone calls and looked into a lot of things to get up to speed on what we're talking about here as best I could. And I was a little surprised at the end of the day, after our discussions, that we were going with BusBoss again, because the TransFinder is really probably, it's the hot system right now. Everyone is falling in love with TransFinder. It's got a lot of the bells and whistles, but we found that BusBoss had the similar bells and whistles. And it just made more sense that they know the area, they've been routing this area, they know the streets. The other company is based in, I think, North Carolina. So that once we saw that the abilities were comparable, the rest fell into place as far as, okay, we do have history with them, they do know our district, they were involved in what happened last year, so they have a vested interest in helping us make sure we get this thing straightened out. And those were the conversations that Dr. Zerby and I had with the owners of Orbit Software before we got into the presentation side of this whole thing and said, you know what, we're going to bring them back to take a look at them. So I would say yes to that question, a long-winded yes.
Okay, and I just want to make sure I understood this. So the IU, as far as the Departmental Oversight, they don't do this for anybody else in Montgomery County?
They do not. Nor did we come up with the idea. The IUs are entrepreneurial in nature. That's what they do, and they're always looking for business ventures.
Revenue.
Absolutely. So this was something that they saw as an opportunity and put it together, and knowing that they're local, if they can be as invested in this as we are, they are, because of their local connection.
Okay. I'll probably circle back and get a little bit more on that. If I look at the finance page, the routing software, this is really just a licensing fee, right? We don't buy the software, is that kind of the way I ought to think of it, the first line, the $56.40?
Yeah, the initial cost, just as a comparison, you can see the difference in, well, you can't see it because you don't have it. I think we were at about, and I can get that to you, we were at about 29, starting off with TransFinder, and then the initial years after that come to about $6,200 for the annual maintenance fees and contract licensing. So it's the initial, you do purchase the software, it's you're utilizing it, so there's a lot of expense up front.
So we buy the software and then we pay after the first year, we pay an annual maintenance fee. Is that how I should think about it?
Yes.
And the maintenance fee is equal to the year one cost, just on the routing software line?
Yes, because both of those are just the annual maintenance fee costs.
So they're giving you the software for free?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about legacy system versus new. So the version of the software that we have is the same version that we would continue to use?
Yes, with the upgrades that we have not utilized at this point. So
we own those upgrades, we just have elected not to use.
The way they're working, every new upgrade, every new advancement is just rolled into the product, and we don't have to pay any charges for those upgrades.
You pay the annual fee.
True.
Okay. as we look at the routing services, the 81, it's 39.8 because of the startup, I understand that, and then 8,100 thereafter. Kim brought up a good point about, how long is this contract? I guess my question would be, if you look at the run of the cost, the 39.8 down to 8,100, how long do we have guarantees out for the year 2 and beyond for the cost? So the
We don't.
5,640, the 8,100, and my guess is we should, even if we only do a one-year deal, we should lock in rates for the options so they can't come back and retrade because we didn't make a commitment to the out years if we only lock in. Or we sign a multi-year contract with a cancellation clause without penalty. So, I mean, you can work it either way, but to me, you want to get the benefit of locking in the rates for as long as we can without getting penalized for it at the end of the day.
So to your question, I don't have beyond the following year. So
I would ask for it. I mean,
yeah, I
once you
but
sign a
you asked,
contract,
and I
once
just wanted to
again,
make sure you know.
you're locked into it.
Absolutely.
You're invested. So,
Yeah.
it'll cost, you would assume it'll cost, year one cost to switch over in future years. So
Right.
I would think we want to make sure we do that. We talked about metrics. We talked about the legacy system. What % of our issues over the past couple of years, specifically this year, was software related? And I'm asking this question because if we have been using this system, we either didn't know how to use it, or we weren't trained correctly, or it's too complicated, or, I don't know what the issue was. So, I'm trying to kind of understand how much was software related, how much was management related, and does this really fix our issues? Because we got a whole host of new things now. We got the IU running it, who's never run a bus service per se. So I think we introduced risk into this. Obviously, you guys have put a great deal of thought into the recommendation. I just kind of want to understand how we're going to avoid the risk.
I can't put a percentage on it, but I would say that the software itself was not one of the primary concerns we had after we kind of did our postmortem from last year. So it wasn't necessarily just the software. It was human error. It was a lot of things that went into what we put into that software, how we managed it, how we worked with it, not necessarily it itself.
So knowing that, as you've got this new operating model that you're recommending, how do we avoid a repeat of the last couple of years?
Well, one of the reasons that we were going back to Bus Boss was the commitment to their training, and I think we need extensive training, both at first student, and we're going to have the IU person trained as well. We need more understanding of the capabilities and much more training around that software, because I think using the things that we're probably going to start using, it's almost going to be like using a whole new software system. So the amount of training that would be needed, now if we went with TransFinder, it would be the same way. It would be starting from scratch and all new training that way. But I think training and management of the processes with our oversight person and persons at the IU is really the only way to try to ensure success moving forward.
Okay. And do we have a guarantee of how much training in hours?
I do. I don't have it with me right now,
Okay.
but we do, yes.
And broken up by the different entities that would need to run it, right?
broken
Because
up
there's
by-
probably management, there's probably reporting, there's a number of different things.
And by how many people, and on-site versus off-site, and the ability, too, for us to be able to get there if we need training beyond what they've offered us. And they've offered us training that doesn't cost us anything at times that we haven't been able to utilize. But their location in Pottstown was another thing that we had talked about as a group after we analyzed all of them and thought that was a plus.
Okay, a couple more quick questions. With the IU, It sounds like, are they actually hiring a new person, or are these people already employed by the IU and they're recommending a couple of resumes to us?
We're not, of the new hire, I'm sorry if I misspoke, that's not for us. The established people there are going to be our people. They need to backfill from their end for some of the duties that they have in their organization. So they're hiring for themselves, not for us. We're going to be using the people that are there and established, so.
Okay. And I just might have misunderstood that. And do we know what percentage of a person, do we have a full-time person plus support? Or is it, how do we know how much of that person we're getting for what we're paying for? Or is it an FTE? Do we get a full-time?
It should be that and more, I think, more than an FT, just because of the commitment that they're making for the two people that do it now and the secretarial support.
I would just make sure you spell that out, because if it's not really spelled out what the minimum commitment is from personnel, I think you kind of run the risk of them thinking they're over the hurdle, and then it dragging down, and then maybe starting to sell that service to other districts. And I would also probably try to get a lock on the resource once they get trained and work with us. We ought to lock that resource in for a period of time, other than if they leave the IU, obviously.
Right.
Because we don't want them to start, hawking the same service and taking the people that kind of went through the battle with us and leveraging it elsewhere. At least I don't think that would work as well. And I guess one last thing, and somebody else brought this up, but it would be helpful, I think, to me, if you could take that last financial page and list out the current costs. It might not align to the specific line items, but, where we can kind of try to get it as close as possible, like Department Oversight, IU used to be our full-time resource, just so we can have that comparative.
Sure.
All right. Nice job on this. Thank you, Dr. Harney.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions. We had several issues this year of a variety of sorts, some of which had to do with communications with parents. And are you suggesting, or is this proposal laid out, that the IU would be responsible for responding to concerns parents had, children being late getting home, missing the bus, being on the wrong bus, that sort of thing?
Those initial concerns right now are handled, and it's always been designed that way by first student. If they call, the bus is late, or is the bus, they have access to the dispatch, they make those calls. If a parent is unhappy about a situation, that's when they would be calling the transportation manager formally. Now they'll be talking to our representative at the IU.
So what is going to cause the first student response to be different this year than it was last year? Because we had so many complaints about people leaving messages and not getting calls back. Are we doing something to improve that with first student?
Part of the issue, I think, with not just first student, but with our response, was the volume of work that was coming through that we weren't handling well. They didn't have enough personnel, and we had that's when we started to put the call center in place, because of the incredible volume of calls. I can't answer specifically that question because I don't know the time frame or the person or the incident, but for the most part, I mean, the year is going through, first student has been fairly responsive with parents, as far as I am aware at this point. I know in the beginning of the year we certainly had our issues, and I think a lot of that was volume, but I can't.
Okay, so of the issues that we had this year, have we identified, made a list of those issues, and we know how they're being addressed with this plan that we are looking at having?
I think the largest piece, that the way we're addressing it, is by improving the product, by improving the routes, making sure that our bus drivers are all involved in the creation and working with us, testing those routes, and having a stronger product is going to, in and of itself, cut down on some of those phone calls. So the volume is going to be less.
Yeah, and
So,
I just don't want to interrupt. One thing that we need to recall is I'm going to consider the middle of July when we started the process last time. We're now talking about starting here at the end of January, early February. So timing is a critical component to making sure that we're able to test things thoroughly and do the appropriate work well in advance of a start of a school year. So that's one of the things we need to keep in mind compared to the experience we had last school year.
and I'd also like to add that I think some of these processes that you're talking about that we really need to be worked on with this group of three and with the IU leading that team to come up with the processes. We do need a whole nother list of A to Z, what we've been doing. That was the design in the beginning of August. We started saying we're going to have all these processes that were going to be interwoven with our side and the first student side, and I don't think they were ever completed. So the part of the duty of the IU is going to make sure that we have processes and that they're monitoring all of the successes and failures, if that be the case, of the processes that they are in charge of as the managers.
Okay, so I think you were saying that there were many more problems because we started later, but we do know what the problems that we faced were, and we do know that they are all addressed by this plan.
Yes, I believe we do have a firm handle on all of the areas that led to what happened last year, and the entire plan is designed to prevent that from happening again by addressing those needs.
Okay. And I just have a question about the cost analysis. Are those numbers arrived at as a result of an estimate of numbers of hours that people would work and rate per hour, or are they guaranteed rates for specific services?
I know that they established their baselines on what they thought it was going to be and on an hourly basis, but they are guaranteed rates. So those are the costs to us on what they believed they were going to accrue. Let's say the IU, for instance, they developed some sort of mechanism that they thought that what they were going to charge us based on what it was how many hours they were going to have to work, how many people they were going to have on the position. So, but I don't have those specifics. They just gave us their number.
Okay, so they gave us an estimate with a desired output that we were asking for, and as long as we include the specifics of what we need to receive from them, they're okay with these rates, and that should be in the contract. Have we developed the actual specific duties that we're asking them to perform, like a job description?
We have not. We have their proposal, which outlines quite a few of the duties that we feel are necessary. But we also we're going to have a meeting with the group before the contracts are developed to talk about what those procedures are going to look like, what the organizational structure is going to look like, so we can build some of those things into the contract. So the meeting we have will be prior to actually the board vote and prior to us completing any contracts, so we can get some ideas for the contracts as far as what those should look like.
Thank you very much.
I have a question about the routing services. So let's say next year everything's status quo. We have to pay almost $40,000 for them to do new routes. Let's say we consolidate the next year. Are we paying another $40,000 because those are all different, or at least, that's not the right number, 40% different routes, or K to 4 different routes? Or I would imagine that number's going to change. That you might not be able to answer, but that's a little red flag. And I appreciate all this information. We need it, and I knew we had something different in the works, and I certainly don't mean to sound flippant, but I feel like I missed something. And I think it's because it was before my time. And I did a little bit of thinking about this, and we keep talking about a transportation manager that we decided we don't want anymore, we don't need anymore, whatever, for whatever reason. And I looked at some other districts, and they have a coordinator of transportation. Now, I know that might seem just like a title, but I remember there being, and this was before my time, so I don't want to give inaccurate information, a transportation manager that was going to be hired that from first student, and their people were uncomfortable with that. But wasn't there a person before that who was willing to do this job for $75,000, I guess, plus benefits? To me, $69,000 for an MCIU, for MCIU help, doesn't seem like to make a lot of sense, and maybe I could be wrong. Like, I feel like you could have a coordinator of transportation in-house and add the benefits. You know, I understand it's not, and it just seems strange to me, and I'm curious what you had mentioned. The person at the MCIU has 20 years of experience in transportation. Well, what are they doing at the MCIU now? Like,
Working in their transportation department.
what do they do? Like, if this is the first time MCIU is doing this kind of services, I'm curious what the MCIU transportation department does. I don't know. I don't know. The bus boss, the routing services, that all makes sense to me, and I appreciate the legwork that went into that. But this IU thing doesn't make sense to me. I feel like you could have someone for doing coordinating transportation in-house. That's not a transportation manager. But this is not my expertise, but adding another party, to me, I'm not comfortable with that. And I know, and maybe I don't know enough, but forget all these other questions. That is my question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that for you. There was several processes. I think Dr. Harney mentioned it earlier this evening in his presentation, that we've gone through, we'll call it several processes to, as a result of outsourcing transportation services several years ago. It's true that there were a number of people that were interested in position of transportation manager, and it's true that there were some decisions made along the way that ultimately landed our most recent transportation manager, and then subsequently his departure. And then some of the issues that we had here in the start of the school year. I think what's important to know that while it may look like there's a cost for administrative oversight, it is a cost that, because it's going to be an annual agreement, it allows us a lot more flexibility and to garner the experience necessary to get this project initially off the ground, with our intent to gradually move away from the IU being our administrative oversight long term, which means that it's our intent, once we have business manager up to speed and on a number of things, but specifically transportation, allows us to then take that over. At this point in time, it's critical that we're not sitting here asking someone who's in HR or someone who is new to the school business office services to help lead a process that is critical to our operation. And we want to leverage the experience of the IU so that we get the work done, and we can then move on from there. So it's part of the long range plan versus this is something we're going to live with on an annual basis.
One other question is, and I don't know if I misunderstood this issue that happened, but I understand there was some issues with the unions and not with the terms of how you choose your route. And that whoever was helping us this fall didn't know that, or I'm not quite sure. But who's the expert on that? Because I felt like, I know Mrs. Hackett asked about what's our list of problems. I felt like there was somebody missing that game. But I would ask two. So my two main questions are to ask this Orbit, what happens if we consolidate? If we consolidate next year and do rerouting, I guess it's all one price. But if we do something, keep things status quo this year and then next year consolidate, is that 80 grand right there? Oh, I didn't mean to make you choke on that number. No, I know it wasn't really, that was not, sorry, I know that wasn't. But, so that's my main question. And two, I would seriously want to look at a coordinator of transportation in-house, and if for some reason that position doesn't exist in 3 years, it doesn't exist in 3 years. That's what happens in teaching, you know, if you have less kids. That's something I would like to consider. I don't know how comfortable I am with, it's not that I don't trust the IU. It makes me a little uncomfortable. They've never done this before. They had a good idea. We can help you. I just don't know why that person can't be in-house, because I feel like we need someone with a vetted interest. Not that the IU doesn't have a vetted interest, not what I'm saying at all. It's that seemed to work, and that seems to be what other people do, even who have outsourced their transportation. I'm going to look more into that, but the few that I know of have someone in-house, and it doesn't have to be a six-figure manager.
Can I just address that for 1 second, just so you have an idea? I would say almost everyone has an in-house person. It's not that we didn't consider that at this point, but we have a timeline to get ready for next school year and to make sure that we don't have what happened this year. And putting that timeline in place, if we should decide if we wanted a transportation manager, we need to act now, and this was really the best way for us to put together what we think is the best scenario for us to have an opportunity to open next school year, because this has to start now, and to go through a process like that would really put us kind of behind the 8 ball. So it's really a now issue.
That's helpful.
Hey, Mike, I have one quick, since I started this whole thing, just a couple things. First of all, I didn't relay my complete thoughts about this, and Dr. Harney and Dr. Zerbi, I like this idea. I'll point blank, I like it. Having gone through the regiment of actually searching for a transportation manager, and Andrea, one of these days I'll fill you in on the whole story. But we've gotten some really good things out of the IU. All right, if some people remember, we got Troy out of the IU. Okay, way back when we were doing our technology audit and everything, he was instrumental in that, and I think we got a piece of gold out of there with him. So I'm willing to give the IU a shot on this, but only because of their experience, and I know some of the people there, they're all really good people. I like the way it's laid out. My only concern is, again, the only concern I have is that point of contact person, that if a parent calls, who are these people going to be? Are we going to use the same folks that we have in there now, or what are we going to do? That's the only thing I have, but I think it's a great plan, and I'm all for it. And as far as the costs go, I mean, the total amount, $130 for year one, and then after that, $98. I think that's in the ballpark of where we need to be. So, thank you.
Okay, I think Mr. Dorn had one more question, and then we'll move on to the budget presentation.
Yeah, just real quick. The IU people will be housed at the IU, not here.
They will, but they'll be on site several days a week here.
Okay.
So that's a good question, because we haven't ironed that out with first student where they will be housed when they're on site here.
Yeah.
But they will be in district on site several days a week.
Okay, and I would probably make sure that for the first month of the school year, that it's not several days, it's every day, along with whatever support they need. I think we know that's where the majority of the issues are going to come up, so you might as well address it contractually, with an expectation that's, I don't know whether it's 3 weeks or 30 days or something like that, but I think you should address that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Heine, and thank you, members of the board. If we would take your seats in the front row, and we have a proposed preliminary budget presentation.
Is this your first official presentation?
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the 2017-2018 proposed preliminary budget. Members of the board, you should have a paper copy in front of you that reflects the presentation here this evening, as well as the same presentation at about 2:30, 3 o'clock this afternoon was revised and posted online for public access, and it'll be there, obviously following this meeting as well. So this evening, the budget timeline, as indicated in a previously September 2016 approval, we are now in January, on January 17th, about 5 items down, with the review of the draft proposal preliminary budget. We flip to the next slide. As you know, the Methacton School District recently underwent a whole strategic planning process, and the vision and mission, as indicated on the left-hand side, and the core values located on the right-hand side, are consistent with what work we do, the values of our students, students, and the organization, and we're proud to say that we're making substantial progress on addressing our strategic plan. If you go to the next slide, please. That strategic plan focus identified through the help of about 80 participants within the community, both business folks, parents, students, staff, administration, to identify 5 focus areas for which the district would primarily operate strategically under. And they're listed there for you. If you flip to the next slide, you also know that in September/October of 2016, the board adopted 3, which I feel are really important goals. 1, to provide leadership, direction, and resources to support that strategic plan. And 2, to exhibit transparent communications within the board and with the public while establishing standards for clear and consistent communication of fiscal matters of the district, and engage the community in ways that encourage positive interaction and the development of public trust through open dialogue and the community input. Therefore, if you flip to the next slide, as a result of the establishment of those board goals, the Finance Committee, in consultation with me, identified the budgetary objectives that will then follow that theme of the board goals and the strategic plan. So the budgetary objectives were to provide a proposed preliminary budget that does not exceed the Act 1 index. 2, to develop a presentation framework that provides consistent means of communicating matters of school budgeting. 3, to provide detailed and summary information that allow for transparent communication of facts and figures with context. And lastly, institutionalize a process, communication, and decisions that result in an annual budgetary approval. Flip to the next slide. You'll see that as part of this presentation, approximately about 53 slides, not all will be covered this evening. However, there are items associated with data that is important for you and the public to understand, those things specifically to staffing and to our buildings that are located in the appendix of this presentation, and will remain there and will be updated regularly as presentations are brought forward. As you can see, as part of this presentation, to kind of create a framework for communicating the context of why we sit and look at figures, it's important to understand our community. So generally speaking, there's some general data here. We serve the families and students of Lower Providence Township, Worcester Township, and included in that is a recognition of the fact that while the district does a lot, and the board provides for an education, an outstanding education for the students of the community, we also have a supportive family structure and community structure in an active home and school associations that raise somewhere over $145,000 annually, as well as other booster clubs and a post-prom committee and organization that is second to none with trying to keep our children safe on some of the most dangerous evenings for a high school child. So if you flip over to the next slide, you'll notice that, and for those members of the Finance Committee, some of the suggestions that were provided as a result of the Finance Committee have been addressed in the presentation, as well as some additional changes that I felt were necessary. So I think it's important for the public and the board to understand that while the district operates on a budget, it is supervised and it is administered through a process where we have a board of school directors, a superintendent, an assistant to the superintendent, and then directors. And under the directors are assistants and or secretarial staff, as well as building principals. And if you notice on this slide, you can get to a complete organizational chart by clicking the bottom right-hand link. If we flip to the next slide, the district has an enrollment as of October 1 of 2016, 4,843 students. And this slide just simply breaks down the ethnicity makeup to give you a better picture of Methacton. If we flip to the next slide, you'll see that in addition to the ethnicity, we felt it was important that we look at some of the special education services and other pupil-related services and how that population breaks out. As you can see, about 70% of our population, or about 110 students, are unduplicated special needs students. 8% of the total population, or 408 students, are identified as gifted. We have 30 homeschool students and 65 charter school students, which is about 19% less than the previous year. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that the Methacton School District is comprised of the buildings and the grade configurations. If we go to the next slide, you can see that as a district, you've made substantial investments in technology to help prepare our youth and our children for the workforce and for college. I think it's important to recognize that, and while there seems to be a lot of information on this slide, it's critical to the understanding that understanding of the context for which we operate, and we do provide a substantial amount of operational and educational instructional technology to our students, staff, and our community. If you will flip to the next slide, please. On this slide, at the February 2007 presentation of the Finance Committee, I will be updating any information that I have available to me to include a 5-year projection for your review and consideration. If you flip to the next slide, you'll see here, this is the 2017-18 proposed preliminary budget. On this slide, you will see that we have the major revenue, expenditure, and net operating categories, along with the actuals from 3 previous years. These are audited actuals. We have the current 2016-17 budget, And then in the second to last column to the right, we have the proposed preliminary budget, and that is considered the projected 2018 budget as of this presentation. And you can see in the last column, last column represents the percent change from the budget of 2017 to the projected of 2018. I will let you know that there's certain pieces of information that I want to get into more detail here. I'm certain that you'll likely have questions, but I think what we need to consider is like on any annual basis, this is the first look at the budget. And if you recall from previous years, we generally don't necessarily find ourselves in June with the same type of exact numbers. So I can tell you that we should expect some change, and when we get later in the presentation, I will share with you that information, which is likely to change, in my opinion, and based on my knowledge at this time. So I think it's important to understand a couple things, and I'd like to start with this slide here and just talk a little bit about some of the revenue items. As you might see, that there's some indication of a percent change in revenue from what was budgeted to what's predicted for next school year. So if you take a look at a couple of these, we can see that under real estate taxes, I want you to know that this increase of 2.93% indicates two things. One, that this budget includes a 2.5% increase in real estate taxes. That is the maximum Act 1 index for Methacton School District. It also includes some adjusted millage values as indicated by the Assessment Bureau of Montgomery County as per the most recent report of December of 2016. So not only does this revenue reflect the adjusted value of property within Methacton, but it also includes that 2.5% on that adjusted property value. So that's where we come up with 2.93%. Primarily, there were properties of Shannondale that have recently been assessed and are the main driving force to the additional increase in millage. If we take a look at some of the other local revenue, you can see that there's about a decrease of about 15%. I can tell you that as of the end of December, we're short of about $250,000 in delinquent taxes. So generally speaking, our budget for 2017 has overestimated the collection of those taxes. Secondly, contributions are down about $30,000 in other local revenue. Those are things that include donations and or other contributions to the district. So as you recall, we did balance the 2017 budget knowing that we would increase by about $25,000 revenue from the sale of advertisements in the gym. And this, that same $25,000 is not going to be, realized in the upcoming year. In addition to that, we have earnings on investments that are over projected historically. We've corrected some of those. We also can see that there's an increase under federal revenue, which reflects the actuals that were not realized at the time of the budget approval for the 2017 budget. So those are that reflects the actual increases that we're receiving in Title I funds, and it includes our understanding that that funding will likely remain the same going into the 2017-18 budget year. So while there may be some other questions that the board has on revenues, I'll save any other comments associated with that for your questions. But to go into revenues, if we could, let's flip over to the next slide. We have a graph here that kind of really, helps us visualize, where the source of revenue comes from. This is not unsimilar to other years, and certainly our local real estate property taxes account for a majority of the revenue that we receive. If we flip to the next slide, it's important that under revenue we understand some of the assumptions, and I'll make some comments. This includes, as I said before, an increase in real estate taxes of 2.5%. It takes into consideration the most recent December 2016 county assessment data. It takes into consideration the Shenandoah escrow. So generally speaking, we've been escrowing somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 annually to address the taxes paid in protest. And we, based on the increased assessment value and the increase in the 2.5% tax increase, that would be the new adjusted rate for, that would be reduced off of our operating revenue. This takes into consideration the review of previous year's revenue collections. So looking at all of our revenue sources, looking historically at how we've performed in revenue, you notice that we've made some adjustments in there as well. It includes current title funding and current basic education subsidy funding. If we flip to the next slide, this is a breakdown of our real estate tax. It looks at the current property tax associated with the 2017 budget and the proposed preliminary budget. If you look at the taxable assessed value, you can see that there is a taxable assessed value increase from the 2017 budget to the 2018 projected, as indicated there on this slide. You can also see that there's a change in the collection rate. And I think there was a question among the members of the Finance Committee about that collection rate and what does that mean and how are we actually using it. So we did some work, and with the help of Mr. Klaus and members of the business office, we were looking at the most recent December information from the tax collectors. And as a district, we actually collect 98.38% of our real estate taxes. And that breaks down to, for Lower Providence, 98.12%, and then for Worcester, it's 98.82%. Now, you may ask yourself, the collection rate here doesn't reflect any of those numbers that I just mentioned. And I believe that the rationale behind these two numbers, 96.48% and 96%, was to address on the PDE 2028 form how to account for the tax appeals under protest. So understand that if it's the wishes of the Finance Committee or the board as a whole, that we include those other numbers that I mentioned on what the actual collection rate is, knowing that the form with further investigation may still need to reflect the deduct for the taxes paid under appeal. We'll address that upon the filing process. But we wanted to be clear to what the actual numbers are, and I think that was the concern of the Finance Committee, and I wanted to make sure that you had that information. And so essentially what you see is, generally speaking, under the 2017 budget, we withheld about $500,000 in tax appeals under protest, whereas we would have, even though we have an additional increase in assessment value, we also need to withhold more money, so that impacts our revenue. Let's go to the next slide, please. I think it's important to also recognize that Methacton is eligible for one of the following Act 1 exceptions for the 2017-18 budget. There are a number of exceptions. I think Mr. Klaus had spoke in the Finance Committee about what those exceptions are, but the district is only eligible for the PSERS exception, which, if they took the full exception, would result in about $411,000 based on the current staffing contingent. So, for example, if we add more staff or we reduce staff, this number may or may not necessarily continue to be the same. All right? If we flip over to the next slide, expenditure summary, this kind of gives you a breakdown of some of the major areas associated with our expenditures. You can look at that at your leisure. We flip over to the next slide. It's important that from that concise summary that the expenditures take into the following considerations. That all staffing groups are budgeted with a 0% staff or a salary increase. It includes healthcare consortium average rates. So what does that mean? The healthcare consortium average rates, we are provided by Aon, which is the healthcare administrator for the Bucksmont Consortium. And they provide several factors to us, but one is an outlook for methactin, as well, which is one of 3 looks that is provided on an annual basis prior to the finalized budget timeframe. But they also provide an average look of how the consortium is performing. This budget includes the consortium average rates. Because it's in my opinion that those rates fluctuate substantially, and it's really based a lot on our current performance with our plan. So I imagine that this rate will change over the next couple iterations as time goes on. The next item, we added a 4th mental health counselor based on recommendations from the high school and our COLA and our Director of Pupil Services. We felt that our students needed the additional coverage of the mental health counselor. This is a contracted service which constitutes about $13,000 increase. The next item, the replacement of equipment for grounds custodial maintenance. This is certainly an area where we've neglected to keep current, and it's in my opinion, as well as the Director of Facilities' opinion, that a lot of our performance in terms of efficiencies are related to not having the proper equipment replaced. And I think that it's important that you understand that I put in this budget $100,000 for the replacement of designated equipment. The next item is the elimination of $556,000 from the healthcare buyout. A little more than 10 years ago, there was an early retirement plan that included a healthcare buyout. As part of that, there was an annual fee that the district was paying to cover that particular matter. This is the last year for that, and therefore that expenditure will no longer exist. So that is reflected in this budget and is removed. The next item includes administrative staff reduction. That is the position of transportation coordinator. The next item includes costs associated with balancing $10 million in each of the next 5 years to address facilities assessment. As you all recall, we've accepted an assessment study, and the Finance Committee as well as the Property Committee are considering what potential actions need to occur in order to address some of those needs. Part of that is the consideration of borrowing or bonding money, and this budget includes what was originally estimated by our finance consultants, PFM. It includes $325,000 in the first year of interest. I believe that that as we get more figures is likely to have a number that will change as well. Next, and I guess the last item on this slide includes a portion of the expense for the new English language arts program. Essentially, the program costs about $679,000 in totality. Both vendors of the products that we're currently reviewing and evaluating have agreed that if we were to purchase their curriculum and their text, they would be willing to work in having the payment of such occur over 3 school years. Now, understanding that, first of all, the board needs to approve the change in an ELA curriculum/text. But it is something that we're currently pursuing, and it likely is going to be a recommendation from the administration for your consideration. It would include finding $224,000 thereabout in the current 2017 budget. It would then include another payment of about the same in the 2017-18 budget, and then it would likely include about the same or the residual amount in the 18-19 budget. Just to understand that whole matter. So in order to avoid having a $700,000 hit into this particular budget, we're looking to soften that matter. If we go to the next slide, the next slide includes other assumptions, but it's the ones that it basically says these are requests that it does not include. So we can see that it does not include any increases or reductions in costs associated with potential school consolidation. So what that means is there's an assumption that, you know, if you close a building or buildings, you would save money, and that's not included in here. And there's also cost in doing the closures. So, for example, you might need to hire a company to transport the books and the desk and things of that nature. So there's some cost associated with this. Neither cost or reductions are included in this budget. As you know, we did remove the high school athletic field escrow of $117,000 from last year's, or from the current operating budget. It's not in this budget either. But it is an item that I would recommend, if we were able to afford, that we would start that process of putting money aside to address that matter long term. And if you recall, that idea was around, you know, over the next 10 years, if we put that money aside annually, we would afford not to have to borrow to do some of what's considered some of the replacement items. The next item is the potential cost for bus routing software and services. So the presentation that you heard this evening from Dr. Harney, you know, it doesn't include any of the new information that he provided. So if it's $130,000, that's not included in this budget. The next item, request for additional staffing. Because of some of the ways that our enrollment is in the building and the way staffing need to be used in order to support our student population, there are a number of requests, and they're listed here, that you know, were made by our building principals, which total about $240,000, and is also not included in the budget. If we go to the next slide, I won't spend much time on this, but this is just a quick way to look at the top 10 expenditures. And quite frankly, the top 3 have been the top 3 for the longest time, with salaries, retirement, and healthcare in that order. If we go to the next slide, the major object summary. Again, this is just another way of looking at the information to help you better analyze and support the administration as we work on the budget going forward. If you flip to the next slide is going to include some more detail, as was requested by the Finance Committee, and is going to be a part of this presentation going forward. But the idea was to follow what we eventually end up approving anyhow in June, which is the format associated with the PDE 2028. And as such, I'm going to go through each of these slides, just point out a couple of things that you ought to understand and consider as we go through this, and then you may have some additional questions. So if you can see under, let's just look at 1100-100 object, where you see that we have personnel salaries. And I did indicate that there is no increase from the 2017 budget to the 2018 actuals, but the numbers show an increase. What that means is the 2017 is the actuals as of December of 2016. And so along the way, from the budgeted amount in June of 2017 to the actuals in December, there are staff adjustments. So there are people that come and go. There are salary adjustments based on taking college credits, et cetera. So that reflects those adjustments as indicated on the sheet. Another item you might want to look at is under the 1100 series, the 400 object. You see that there is a 3,312% increase. That's reflective of the move from the tech lease was moved from the 5200 series, object 700, to this location. And based on our conversation with the Finance Committee, as well as the work that Danielle Penza has done with making sure that we're properly coding things for the long term, it was felt that this is where that item should be in the budget. If we flip to the next slide, you can see that under vocational programs, you can see that under function 1300, object 100, you see a decrease. Well, that reflects the fact that we had salaries and benefits budgeted for certain staff. They had left, and then they're repurposed with a lesser expensive staff member as of the change in December. So it reflects, instead of having a senior staff member, it actually reflects a bachelor's plus 15, as we commonly use as the placeholder. If we look down under the next section, under the 1400 functions, we can see that there's about, under 400 object, you can see that there's about an 18% decrease there. That's realized through a renewal of our lease of our driver ed vehicles. And you can also see there's some salary reductions as well. We lost one of the driver, we'll call them aides, and they were replaced with a lower salary individual recently. If we flow to the next slide, you can see that under the non-public programs, while there's nothing budgeted there, we don't have all the information necessary to provide a number there, so that is really left blank and is part of this budget. But in June, it's likely to have a number similar to what's there, but what's in previous years. But just know that it's without information at this time, and because it was a minor amount generally, without putting a number in there, we just didn't put any number. Adult education programs, this includes a community ed program that generally supervised by Ms. Lynch. Flip over to the next page. You can see that under pupil personnel services, 2100, in this type of function, you see the counselors, the directors, supervisors of special education, the psychologist, home and school visitor are all consumed in that particular function area. Under instructional staff services, this is where we see our librarians, our technology integrators, our professional development coordinator, as well as our director of curriculum instruction and assessment. You'll see that there's about a 49% increase in function 2200, 600. That's under supplies. Primarily, that's inclusive of library software and book increases. If we flip over to the next slide, we can see that under administrative services, this includes the budget of folks like Dr. Harney's office, my office, our secretaries, principals, Ms. Lynch, the tax collectors, and there's also probably the most significant increases in the 400 object. It's about 198% increase, but that includes some equipment for the high school to do what we believe are needed furniture arrangements in the library. The next one, pupil health, 2400 function, that includes our nurses, our occupational therapists, and our physical therapists. We'll flip to the next slide. Business services pretty much stayed the same. You can see that there is a decrease in the salaries pretty much. That's a difference likely in the director position. If you look at the operation and maintenance of plant services, I want to get a little bit into detail on this because this includes some new pieces of information. So this includes the department with Mr. Fretz, Mr. Barbagallo, the custodians, maintenance, etc. It also includes the SRO. So if you go to line object 300, the SRO, while it's not all SRO, 200 of this under budget 2017, 200,000 of that was for the SRO program, as we indicated. The other 30,000 is for contracted services from the facilities department. But if you notice, we did do a decrease because of the way the cost projections came in for the SRO program, and so we're currently estimating being about 175,000 with the SRO program, not necessarily needing the full 200 as we move forward with our new era in SRO services. If we go down to the 700 object property, you can see that there's a budgeted number of 305,000. That includes the 5,000 from 2017. It includes 100,000 for the equipment, as I mentioned in a previous slide under the assumptions, and it also includes the 200,000 that we annually have used to roll over into the capital fund. So I just want to explain that for a second. If you recall, upon my arrival, we had recognized that our capital reserve was being depleted annually, and as a mechanism to provide that information or to address that issue, the board and the administration agreed to put money aside in a series of years in order to replenish that fund. In the current 2017 budget, we have $300,000 set aside, and as the plan was, the next year we would add another 100,000. Again, what was discussed with the property committee and what was discussed with the finance committee were to take that money, instead of sending it all 400,000 to the capital reserve, is to and then to spend out of that capital reserve to address some building type projects, not necessarily capital projects, but certain needs that a building principal would have. And the example that I often use is we have a stage curtain that needs to be replaced. Well, that's not something that happens on an annual basis. To throw that into a building budget kind of produces a one-year anomaly associated with a particular building's budget. Therefore, it was thought by the property committee as well as the finance committee that instead of sending money or putting money into buildings or sending that money over to the capital reserve and then pulling from that to address stage curtains and other matters, that we would keep an account in the budget and send a portion of that money to the reserve and leave it there. So this 2017-18 budget would include generally the $400,000, 200 of it going into the capital reserve, and 200, as indicated in the 2600 700 object series, is in that budget. So I know it was a long-winded explanation, but I thought it was important that we thoroughly understand what we decided and what makes that up, because it does show a 6,000% increase, and it probably stood out for you. Next slide. If we look at this is student transportation services. Likely under the 100 object, it includes the reduction of a transportation manager. This budget area also includes bus aids. It includes fuel and the contracted services for first student. If we go down to central and other support services, 2,800, this is the technology department, and there's nothing unusual about that particular area. We flip over to the next slide. Expenditures, again, continuing expenditures by program. You'll see that the 2,900 is the IU budget. That's likely to be adjusted. down based on population or student enrollment. So I imagine to see that number decline. I don't know how much at this point in time, but a decline is likely. Next, student activities, 3,200. This includes some staff that run the athletic office as well as coaches. If we flip over to the next slide, you can see that the community services, 3,300, not a whole lot of activity associated there. And then we have the last, one of the last categories on this slide, which is debt service. As you can see, it includes the $325,000 additional dollars projected for the 2017-18 budget. Next slide. Under 5,200, you'll see that there's a reduction of 100% in the 700 property line. That is the $1 million for the tech lease services that was back up under the 1100 series. And it includes the additional $200,000 that we were going to transfer over to capital. And on the last part of this is the budgetary reserve, and that's the typical amount that we include in the budgetary reserve annually as part of the budgeting process. That concludes the expenditures by program, PD 2028. If we look then at some of the analysis associated with this budget, we can see that on the left-hand side there's a real estate tax analysis. Not only does it talk about what this budget, if it was the final budget, and it included these tax increases, what it might mean to local taxpayers, as well as on the right-hand side, it's a small glimpse of a cost analysis associated with some of the other districts that are part of the Montgomery County Technical Career Center. So it shows our cost per student, which is probably the number that may stick out the most for you as board members. If we go over to the next slide, considerations. So this budget, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is really our first look. And certainly it is not our last stop in trying to make sure that we provide an efficient and effective budget that allows our schools to operate as our community so expects. But it doesn't include some major things that I felt was important for us to at least list here and understand. It doesn't include anything related to school consolidation. So it doesn't take any of the benefits from it. It doesn't take any of the negatives from it. It doesn't include any adjustments for pending labor contracts. So you notice, as I mentioned and indicated in the assumptions, that we have zero budgeted as increases for any of the labor groups, including the administrative staff, as part of this budget. Quite simply, that's because we don't have a number at this point in time, and that's what we need to understand and consider. The next is healthcare performance. While we use the average numbers, my hope is that our performance comes into to play and helps us better address the overall cost with healthcare for our employees. But that is yet to be seen. We get 2 more looks before we get to a final proposed budget, and we'll continue to keep the board updated on how well the healthcare program is performing. Capital projects. Certainly the board hasn't adopted any capital projects associated with the facilities assessment. While we're considering a lot of things associated with that, it's critical that we not only address it, but does our need to address these projects fully, are they fully realized in this budget? While we put $10 million aside, the board may decide that it might be more economically and more feasible to borrow more than the $10 million, which would change in a given year and change what we may or may not be able to budget for interest. So that's just something to understand. The next one is probably the most challenging one for me at this stage of the game. While I probably can give you guesstimates on what's going on in the things before that, and maybe even after that, the state funding, there's a lot of dialogue, and I think it's important that the public and the board are aware of this. There is a lot of dialogue in Harrisburg about repealing the property tax as a mechanism for funding schools. So what does that mean? Well, prior to the end of the last session, the legislature was one vote shy of doing just that. They are now gearing up for the new session, and it is likely to be the number one priority of some, maybe many, of those in office to address this matter. All indications point to the fact that if passed, it would likely prevent school districts from raising property taxes to address a budget or revenue need. I'm trying to weigh my words here properly. And as such, that would go into effect July 1 of 2017. So that means that the budget that I'm proposing here today is likely in jeopardy of realizing the revenue that I'm associating with this balanced budget in the reality if the legislation changes. So, and then ultimately the concept or the general framework for funding schools would then be left to the personal income tax as well as the increase in sales tax. So there would be an increase in your personal income tax and sales tax, with the understanding that shifting the philosophy from homeowners to individuals with the ability to pay. The concept always on removing property taxes and funding schools is the ability to pay. Those that make more money would likely be the ones that could pay more money to fund these types of schools versus leaving it all up to property taxes. So we're going to continue monitoring that progress. And it's a major concern. I'll keep the board apprised. We may be called to action at some point. That may be something that the board would want to consider. Certainly, it's no secret that property taxes is pretty, while no one likes to pay more taxes or any taxes in some instances, it's a pretty consistent and reliable understanding of what we need. And imagine, you saw my collection rate of about 98-point-some%. I can pretty much guarantee that if I have an assessed value of X, I can get 98% of that historically. However, with personal income tax and with sales tax, those two items are directly tied to the health of the economy. And what I haven't seen in any of the details is how one would manage that and how schools in general are going to be funded if there's a shortfall in those types of revenue. So again, there's a lot to understand. There's a lot of information yet that we do not have. And I just look forward to making sure that the public and the board are apprised of any changes that are pending. If we look at federal funding, I said earlier that it appears that the Title I and other title funding that we receive is likely going to remain consistent. While there certainly is some changes in Washington, all indications at this point indicate that we're going to see that same funding. So if we go to the next slide, or in the economy, I spoke about that. It's associated really with how state funding and other funding may take into consideration. Next slide. So the decisions. This is where we need to, as a board on the 24th, which is our regularly scheduled board meeting, we need to, if so desired, to pass a resolution to keep any real estate tax at or below the Act 1 index. There is a resolution that is provided on the work session agenda this evening as per the recommendation of the Finance Committee, and the board can have discussion about that. And it's my recommendation that if we are going to do that, that we do pass that on the 24th. And if we don't decide to do that, then the rest of the items on this sheet indicate the timeline and the actions that need to occur. Next slide. As you can see, what I'm going to do historically is just keep a running record of some of the decisions that we make, and for for history purposes. And last slide, this is the appendix. There's some capital project listings in the back here, as well as school data for your review. And that ends my presentation, and I ask the board to, take a seat back up at the table, and I'll be open to any questions.
All right, thank you very much for the budget presentation, Dr. Zerbe. This time we'll start at the other end of the table. Ms. Reese, if you have any questions.
One, and it's more, the understanding behind it. I'm sure there's an answer that's not difficult. Why do you start the budget with a 0% increase? I'm just curious. I'm sure there's a reason. I just don't know what it is.
A 0% increase. I'm assuming you're referring to salaries.
Sorry, yes.
Okay. All right. That's all right. Because we actually have an increase, and generally speaking, when people talk about that, it's an increase of costs, which would require the, as documented here, 2.5% tax increase. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are in budget negotiations, and that item has yet to be resolved.
When we spoke at the Finance Committee meeting, one of the questions I raised was about the collection rate, and you indicated tonight, I think, that the actual collection rate is over 98% on real estate taxes. And I wondered if we have historical comparisons of collection rates on real estate taxes for, say, the last 2 or 3 years. And compare that to the actual budgets that we have given over those same periods of time, to get a sense of how closely we budget for that particular number. I think it would be helpful to know that.
Yeah, I only included the most recent data. So, but I agree. We just didn't have that time from.
Okay, sure.
I guess, I've been through this at the Finance Committee, so I don't have a tremendous amount of questions. We had a pretty thorough discussion there. But I think it would be helpful as we work through the budget process to understand what risks against the budget that you foresee. Obviously, you've done a lot of work, you and Tom have done a lot of work on this with the various heads, but as you think about the risks that could either allow us to come in lower or higher, can you talk a little bit to what those might be at this point in time? I know we have the assumption category, but what other risks do you see? And maybe there is none now that you haven't covered.
Well, I think most of the risks are in the assumptions, but maybe it'd be better if I pull them out and clarify them at a future presentation. I see what you're getting at, but they're in there, but they're really probably not clear.
Not as.
Yeah, it's not apparent. I get it.
Okay, that's it for me.
I'll skip myself for the time being.
Okay, I don't have any questions at this time, but I do want to say that thinking back to looking at a similar type of presentation a year ago and seeing the difference between where we were then and where we are now, I don't know if it's a virtue of my experience as a board member or the progress that we've made with our budgeting, but I'd like to think that it's a little bit of both. I'm feeling a whole lot better about this budget than I did about the same that we saw a year ago today, or about this time. So I appreciate the work that's gone into this. I can see that it's still not ideal, but I'm feeling like we're in a better place now, maybe in terms of our understanding of finances on my side and yours. But yeah, I can see that a lot of work went into this, so I appreciate that.
I must say that, it's a complete team effort from the business office, and getting the direction from the finance committee helped, kind of frame this whole thing together. So I think it's an indication of the work and the interests of the board to, be transparent and to provide information and to create the dialogue necessary. So thanks for recognizing that.
Excuse me. A couple of quick questions. Brenda mentioned, obviously the collection rate. That's a big difference between 96 and 98, and what that goes into the budget. So obviously, as this is a preliminary budget and the process of complete clarity, that number will change probably, and probably change upwards, I suspect.
I just want to be clear on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Without going into the historicals, which I haven't done, okay? But we will do that. I just want to make it clear that while I'm telling you that the collection percentage actually is 98.38, the numbers that were being used were used to reflect on the PDE 2028. So even if I change the number back, I'm not anticipating gaining any new revenue. I think it's just a matter of properly representing those numbers for us. But we may see a difference if we look historical on numbers. So that's where there could be some change there. But I'm not looking for a huge swing in this. I don't presume that it'll be there, but let the numbers speak for themselves. But I just want to be wary of that, because without going into that, making the change isn't going to show a drastic change.
And I on slide 18, actually showing what the PSERs and the recommendation of the Finance Committee is, so that from a transparency perspective, we're seeing all the numbers and what it means. You did mention on page 20, which on the ELA program, I know that we're not there, it's not for discussion, but did I hear that the 225 of the 1/3 of the payment is meant to be paid for in this budget year?
So in order to make the project work and to lessen the blow on any particular budget, typically it would be like a $700,000 bill. A $700,000 bill into this budget, pretty much, creates a problem. So in order to, find, creative and more manageable ways to do it, it would be over three, because I looked at doing over 3 payments. We could do 2 payments, which would be a payment in 17-18 and then 18-19, but that would be, again, larger numbers than what I have listed here. So yes, if the board approves this at the time we recommend it, we would also be recommending, how to pay for that as well. So I'm not saying we have that money just yet.
But it just...
It would come with the recommendation.
The recommendation would be to pay 1/3 of it in
the current operating
16-17 school year.
That's accurate.
And then 1/3 of it in this budget, and 1/3 in next year's budget, the 2-year period.
That's accurate.
Okay. And then on slide 21, you mentioned about what's not included. The additional staffing of 240 is this partial. It seems very, very low for the request that are listed here. So there's 5 PCAs, a special ed, an IA, a recess aid. Is that partial? It's not full-time equivalents for 240,000?
Dr. Harney, do you recall those requests?
No, I do not. I don't have it with me. I don't know.
Let us gather that information to be accurate on the response.
Get that tomorrow.
Yeah, it's all right, just a comment maybe. And then on that same slide, you mentioned that the 117, just for clarity, it's not included in this year's budget. It would be the recommendation to try to put it in this year's budget. But from comparison perspective, for our current school year, this 117 is not in there. As none. So it's not a reduction, actually. So and then from the last, yes, it's just a comment. Again, from a perspective of transparency of what's in the numbers, it's not really a change. And then the one other comment I would make on appreciate your comments related to the state funding. And what I have read, one of the things that also from a risk perspective that Scott has indicated is that the only thing that you could continue to have local taxes is your debt related to December of 2016. So this $325, the $10 million or the $50 million or whatever ends up being over the time, that would be required to be coming from state money, not new money locally. So that from a risk perspective, there's a property risk element to our budget that's on top of just the normal budgetary risk.
That's accurate.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for putting all this work together. It's definitely a new format than what I've seen, although I've seen some things before, but just a couple of comments. This budget's in its infancy as we go through it, but there's a couple things that I'd like to charge the Finance Committee with looking at as they go through this. Keep an eye on things like personal services, employee benefits. I realize some of those costs are fixed. They go up automatically, this, that, and the other, but when I look at central and other support services, 2,800, I see that going up 24%. That's a red flag there. Reason why, why is it going up over 100 grand? Under supplies in the same category, that's going up 25%. So stuff like that. That needs some, combing out as to find out why those are going up. As far as the athletic fields, I am strongly supporting that we get that $117,000 in this year. I was very disappointed we couldn't do it last year. I just don't want, we made a commitment when we did this project, we made a commitment to the public that we would maintain these things, keep them professionally done, and when the time comes in 10 years to replace them, that we'd have the money in the bank to do that. I do not want to see that coming back. I won't be on the board in 10 years. I don't think so. And I don't want to have to see that this district going to borrow money for these fields, to replace the fields. We should be saving that money. We should be doing that. And if you look at those two line items there's your $117,000, okay? So however you do it, that 117 has got to be in this upcoming budget. The last one that is, of course, the big elephant in the room is a 0% increase in the salaries. That is a major issue that I just don't even want to go down that road, but I mean, it'd be neglecting it if we don't talk about that. But again, I want to thank you all for doing a lot of work on this. It's definitely a lot of work and a lot more to go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. Just a couple of little recap things here. When Dave spoke to the collection rate and the difference between the 96% and the 98%, and that this gets a little bit towards Paul's, and please stop me if I'm overstepping here, but basically the idea is that bottom line number is not going to change. It's really the difference, if you talk about the escrow, between the gross amount that you're going to collect using the collection rate and the net amount that you'll get at the bottom. So even though you can tinker with the collection rate to more accurately reflect what it is, the bottom line there shouldn't be that drastically different than what we're seeing here. To Brenda's point, it is worth looking at historical years to see if that 98.3 is realistic. I mean, I think we've seen in the past it's been a little bit lower than that. So that is something we should look at. In terms of the federal funding, the Title I funding, this is a question. The increase in the Title I funding, we saw that this year, and we went ahead with additional staff, I believe. Would that be the continuing use of that money if the federal funding stays the same?
That's exactly what we would continue to use it for, and if the federal funding were to be cut, so would those positions.
Okay, just wanted to make sure there. As a matter of note, and it is in this presentation here, the Finance Committee has recommended that the board pass the resolution next week, and the resolution would state that the budget would not go above the Act 1 index of 2.5%. That was a unanimous decision amongst the Finance Committee, and that can certainly be discussed more next week, but I did want to make sure that the board knew that. And as you can see, there's a lot of detail, and Kim kind of brought it up. There's been talk amongst the entire Finance Committee in the past that we needed a clear and transparent way of showing the numbers from presentation to presentation. There's a lot of detail in here, probably more than you're used to seeing, but it was important to start off with, here's where we're at. It's our first look, but here's where we're at. Numbers in every category, which is the official way that it gets filed through the PDE form. And the important part about this is, too, that Dr. Zerbe mentioned, there's going to be slides moving forward that from month to month, when the Finance Committee meets and we come back and forth to the work sessions, that we're going to track the important changes in the dollar amounts that are going to change from month to month. And that is a complete and I'd say perfect unison of the Finance Committee here, as we really wanted to make sure that, we are all on board with constantly making sure that all of the information is portrayed for the entire board to see. And we recommend any of the members of the public who have, financial questions or financial matters, come to these Finance Committee meetings and, question things that you may have. And I believe that is all I have, so thank you very much.
So then we'll move. So then if we know that at next week's meeting, we'll have reports. We'll also we'll have public comment on any of the action items for the 24th. We'll approve any of the board minutes, and then the fiscal items. So there's a list of bills, the treasurer's report, and budgetary transfers. Are there any questions about any of those items at this moment in time?
Just real quick, the Finance Committee had a couple questions, Tom, regarding the tax collector compensation and the millage reimbursement rate, and I know you had a little bit of information on this. If you could just provide that so that people know ahead of next week's meeting.
I think you have that information there.
Yeah, I do. So item 9D in the agenda, the mileage reimbursement rate, the IRS rate actually decreased. However, it does reflect an increase for methactin, whereby we were discounting that at 80%, at rather 20% discount, paying employees, reimbursing employees at 80%. That increase is going to cost the school district about $2,800, we figured. So not a lot at all. The tax collector compensation, which is the agenda item 9F, resolution 1701. The contract year actually is effective July 1st, 2018 through 20, and then July 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2022. That rate by law has to be, or the rates whereby we pay these collectors by the bill, has to be approved by state law sometime in February. They approached us with an increase that we did some benchmarking relative to other townships and relative to other school districts, and we found that the rate increase is actually at the bottom level of all other districts that we looked at. That's a 30-cent increase per bill for each of the 2 years in this 4-year contract. That's an estimated $3,900 every 2 years increase. Again, the going from $3 to $3.30 was a lot less than some of the other school districts we looked at.
Thank you. Then lastly, on the finance is the Act 1 resolution, as you indicated. If we go on to personnel matters, there are items for change of status, compensated leave, uncompensated leave, et cetera. Are there any questions for Dr. Harney in any of those items under personnel? Mr. Harney or Dr.
I just want to make a clarification. We're going to change number 1, employment classified, just to add that Title I position. Just triggered in my mind that conversation about Title I that was not in there. That Teresa Christ is moving into a Title I position. I wanted to make sure we'll get that noted next time.
Any other questions from the members of the board? If not, we'll move on to curriculum. There are no recommendations at this time from Dr. Katona. Policy, as you can see, there are several policies listed, about 15. That's a little more than several. So about 15 policies for first reading. And I know the policy committee worked hard on this. It also includes many of the 00 policies that have to be reviewed every 2 years. And those are up for first reading, no items for second reading. If you look at under other, there are some gifts and donations as indicated on there. Are there any questions about gifts and donations? If not, also there's approve a trip for the Methacton High School girls lacrosse team. There's also property appraisal services. So I am asking for the authorization to secure a firm to provide property appraisal services for the Arrowhead and Audubon Elementary school properties. This is a recommendation out of the last school consolidation meeting, whereby the board directed Milo and McBroom to come back with some additional information, as well as my administration to come back with financial information, and this is just part of that process. Okay, the next for this.
Can I just, real quick question? Do we have a ballpark about, what a firm like that would charge for this type of service? Are we getting
Still getting that information. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Then there's some dates for the board's consideration. And then under, under new business, I have two things that I want to make sure that the board's aware and will likely be on the agenda for for your consideration on the 24th. In the paperwork that you have in front of you, there are two sheets in draft format. The first one is a grid, or we'll call it an Excel grid. And that Excel grid indicates that there are 4 bids that were received this morning as part of the stormwater and site improvement project resulting from some of the work that still remained with the high school field renovation. As you can see, the numbers came in as indicated on the draft form. However, as per review of the available information, we're not able at this stage of the time frame to even make a conditional recommendation of who the vendor should be. There's a disparity in some of the pricing, and therefore it will require us to get additional information to confirm that the pricing so does reflect the intent of the bidder to complete the work as specified. So I want you to have that in draft format for your review, and if we are in a position where we can make a thorough recommendation, it will be communicated with the board in advance and the rationale why, and it could become an agenda item listed on here. So that would happen obviously before Saturday when this agenda goes live. So if I don't have it done by Saturday, it might have to wait for another time frame. Okay? Any questions on that particular matter without giving names of the bidders and things away?
A question on what the process can be. I mean, we've just had a very large project that we did get a bidder, and I assume that was the lowest bidder.
Yes.
Do we also get references and experience of how these contractors have worked with other major projects in the past?
Right. That's all a part of the bidding process. There's, and I'm not the one to really speak to this on the true technicality, but there is some value to being the lowest bidder, but it's the lowest acceptable bidder. So did they bid on the work appropriately, and there's no shortcutting of the deliverables associated with it? They just they could have there are certain things that just stick out, and there's some information that kind of sticks out and says, hey, I think we better look at this. So leading that process is Fadavy, our construction management team, along with Mr. Fretz, and we're going to be having whatever dialogue we need, either from our solicitor's office or elsewhere, in order to make sure that when we make a recommendation, it's one that's sound and is considerate to the concerns that we've had about our previous work. And then, in addition to that document, there's a draft document that's in front of you. It's in a letter format, and the motion will likely be on the agenda for the 24th, and it will say to authorize the solicitor of the Methacton School District to send the attached letter with a copy to the bonding company to Applied Landscaping Technologies. And essentially, this letter, in summary, is indicating that due to a breach in contract, the district is recommending, or the administration is recommending to the board to approve the termination of Applied.
So we ought to just clarify, Dave, what Applied was and did for the school district.
So Applied Landscaping Technologies is currently the prime general contractor for the field renovation project. Any questions on this matter? If not, that ends anything that I have, and it opens up for courtesy of the floor.
Courtesy of the floor, please.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. Linda Wynn from Collegeville. I've been emailing the board and Dr. Zerbe and Dr. Harney, my husband and I both, since September concerning a transportation issue with my son. He's a little sixth grader at Devon Prep, and it takes 6 hours, sixth grade, but it takes him an hour and 45 to 2 hours to get home. We've been on this issue since September, and we have no resolution. In fact, the other day we were told, too bad, you have to wait till next year. We've been told to be patient. I understand there were a lot of problems in the beginning of the year. We were told to be patient. There are children that don't have a bus. Okay, we waited. We were told, don't worry, it'll be fixed. We'll look into it. Don't worry, it'll be fixed. And in my most recent conversation with Amy Huffman the other day, I was told, no, we're not going to do anything. You just have to wait till next year. In discussing with her what will happen next year, she advised that a new router is already working on it, that we would be a priority to reduce the time it takes my son to get home. And she said that they would look into adding a transfer. And I said to her, well, he has a transfer in the morning. Why can't we just do a transfer in the afternoon now? She was not aware that he had a transfer in the morning. So I have to say my confidence that this was seriously looked into is low. If you don't know my son's route, how can you be looking into it to fix it? And I don't know who all was involved with Amy in this discussion, but again, I don't have faith, and I hear there are changes that are coming now, thanks to Dr. Harney's presentation, changes that are coming now for next year. Again, what is going to happen next year then with an untested entity, which was a concern of some of the board members here, and I echo that. There's been very little communication from the very beginning of the school year. I had to call to find out when my children's buses were. I have yet to receive anything in writing. I had no idea that my son had a transfer until he told me. I didn't know either that they fixed the route, and the problem is there are three schools outside the district on this one route, and it's just too much. You can't get all the kids home in a reasonable amount of time in the current system. It was fixed because instead of picking my son up first, he had, I would assume, the earliest dismissal. They went and grabbed the other kids and then came back and grabbed my son. So now he sat at school for 35 minutes before a bus picked him up. He did not get home any sooner. I don't know how, without taking work out of the system, it was felt that that would be a remedy for this. The first few days of school, he didn't have a bus. We just knew that because no bus showed up, and we called and we were told there was no driver. Again, no communication, which comes to some of the concerns with the board members as to what's happening next year, which is why I highlight that. We've received nothing in writing. If one of the schools on this route does not have school that day, the timing changes. Again, unknown to the parents when my son didn't get picked up because one of the schools was off and the bus came early. There needs to be much, much better communication moving forward, and an hour and 45 minutes is unacceptable. Unacceptable to get a sixth grader home from school. And we were told that there was going to be a protocol, for example, when one of the schools didn't have sessions, and we haven't seen that yet. And I won't accept that this has to wait till 2017. This is my first day back to work today after a bilateral mastectomy. That's how serious this is to me, that this get corrected for my son and the other boys from Devon Prep that are on the bus. Some of the parents are equally as frustrated as we are that nothing is happening. We're told that he gets home earlier than he does. The bus is in the depot at 4:20. We had to resort to taking pictures, time-stamped on your phone, for when my son gets off the bus and sending them in to prove the bus is not in the depot at the time you're telling me. So, I'm exasperated at this point. I think we've been beyond patient in waiting for something to happen and going through the proper channels and talking to people and emailing. And now I'm told that we just have to wait till next year. I don't know why the afternoon route can't be the same as the morning or similar with a transfer. Amy told me that transfers, I guess, are not really acceptable, but we already have one on my son's route. And my daughter is also out of district, and her route is fine. We have no problems. And I've never had a problem with, any of the busing in Methacton until this year. So I'm very concerned to hear that we now have another variable coming for the future, because this has really been a bad year and has negatively affected my son.
Can you refresh my memory real quick? I read many of your emails, but is it my understanding that you mentioned other children, that they don't ride the PM bus anymore because of this, but you are the one remaining soul? And I'm not trying to make light of it, but I just am trying to remember all the emails.
No, that's correct, Andrea. One boy had sports, so the parent was not aware of the situation, and the other one, the mom is leaving work early to come pick up her son. I mean, that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable, and that's very inadequate service and poor communication, from the very start of this school year. Again, something changed. I don't know what it is, but it needs to be rectified, and that's why I'm here tonight, to figure out what we can do to shorten the time it takes my son to get home, because an hour and 45 minutes is unacceptable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? John?
Good evening. John Andrews, Lower Providence. The lady who just spoke, I think, was deserving of a comment along the lines of, we'll look into it. But maybe it's my ears. I didn't hear it. So, it's certainly something that doesn't happen to a director's child in any school district. But what's
I will
the
beg to
difference?
differ that my own children did have issues this year.
All right.
And I have communicated with the Winds.
Okay, all right.
Just FYI.
All right, all right.
I would really appreciate not to be attacked. I felt like Mrs. Wynn was very courteous. I would really
Yes, she was.
appreciate not to be attacked, or anybody up here.
I'll echo that point,
And
John, and
I would really
John, you know about this. I also had problems with my son as well. Okay? So before you go start accusing and doing these things, you and I have gone down the road about this before. And what she brought up was valid concerns. This is public comment, not public discussions. Thank you.
The timeline for what may turn out to be a school closure involves a hearing And I claim that we have not had a hearing as required by school code, and the school code goes on to further state that the board vote on a closure has to wait for at least 3 months after that hearing. So relative to what's going to happen this year, that doesn't preclude redistricting, but I think it precludes a school closure this year, which, unfortunately may have a hit on the budget, but I think that, democracy should prevail, and we need to continue on the path of careful reasoning to get to an option that is overall the best one. Not that it won't be difficult, or it hasn't been difficult so far. A hearing has to be advertised as a hearing, not as a special meeting or as a town hall meeting. And the school code speaks to advertising in a newspaper 15 days ahead of that hearing. And I've been watching the circulation on the Times-Herald going down, 10-12% a year. Also, not everyone is tuned into frequently checking the Methacton website. So I think relative to that hearing, if indeed it is called for at some time, that the taxpayers deserve postcard mailings. Maybe that's $5,000, but I think it's a pittance relative to the issues of a school closing. And there's an item on next week's budget relative to property appraisal services for 2 of the elementary schools, Audubon and Arrowhead. And if you think of either one of those schools as to what is its real value, if it's in good operating condition, good maintenance, it's comparable to the cost of a new school, something on the order of $30 million. Well, now we have a situation where maybe we have to spend $15 million to get up to that level, so you could argue that the present worth of those schools, I'm not talking about depreciation or anything like that, but the present worth of them is on the order of $15 million in terms of dollars and cents. The other consideration for the taxpayers is that if you assume that each of these schools supports, let's say, 4,000 homes, that's not an accurate number, but it's a rough estimate. And if that one of those schools or both of them are taken away, it probably affects the market value of each of those homes, something on the order of $10,000. $10,000 times 4,000 homes is $40 million. So, bottom line, closing Arrowhead, for instance, would represent a hit on the taxpayers. And, perhaps one thing relative to options is that, if there's agreement to close one school, I'm not saying there would or wouldn't be, but, it might make sense overall to keep Audubon open and demolish Arrowhead and rebuild a new school there, rather than fix a school with an obsolete design. And that's something that would happen over a number of years.
Mr. Andrews, if you could finish up, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. So I think those are the comments that I thought were appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Brian Earnshaw, Lower Providence. First, thanks a lot for the budget information. I think it was a vast improvement over prior years, and it was great to see a preliminary balanced budget with a 2.5% tax increase as opposed to last year, which I think was about close to 7% when it was first presented. So I think with 5 months to go or so, that you've got a lot of room to make some further changes. A couple questions. I know it might have been in the presentation, which I don't have a copy of, but how much was the total salaries in the budget for next year? Was that like a $30 million, $35 million number? Just ballpark.
The budget is posted to the website. I mentioned it didn't get posted until about 2:30, 3 o'clock.
Right, so that's why I didn't get the chance to.
Yeah.
But it's listed in the categories.
It is. It's projected as 43.
43 million.
Yeah.
43 million, okay. So from a sensitivity standpoint, if you put salary increase at 1%, with PESERs, you're probably looking at about $700,000. PESERs and other taxes. Just keep that in mind. I think that's good perspective to know, because there was some comments, the fact that there was 0% built in, so from a sensitivity standpoint, 1% is probably going to cost roughly $600,000 to $700,000. I think that's good information that you might want to consider looking at. How much was the PESERs increase? Was that in the presentation? I know it's buried in a lot of the benefits numbers across all of the functional departments.
It is in the presentation, but
It is,
if
okay.
you would-
I'll look at it
Thank
there then. Okay. Just a couple of considerations that I would take a look at. I would leave the $117,000 out for the fields. I think that money could be better spent on addressing the $100 million of other facility needs. Again, I've said this before, the $200,000 budget reserve, I would take that out. I mean, I view that as a slush fund. If you have some spending that comes up that unexpected, cut something else. I mean, you should be able to find that in a $100 million budget. And I also raised this in the past as well, is taking a look at that per capita tax, which I think generates less than $100,000 in revenue, but about a third of that revenue goes to covering the costs of billing it. So it's very inefficient, the collection of that revenue. So I would take a look at getting rid of that possibly. And I know Springford has done that recently as well. Then I guess the other question is, with respect to the Montco Healthcare Consortium, how much is the amount of those excess premiums that they're still holding on behalf of Methacton? Might be something to take a look at. I think it's close to $2 million, if I remember correctly. And then also, did I hear right that effectively we would be eliminating a transportation coordinator position and outsourcing that to the MCIU? Is that what's built into the budget? Or is it just not replacing?
Is the transportation coordinator position is removed from the budget, and there are no costs associated with Dr. Harney's presentation earlier this evening.
Okay, so those are not built into there yet. Okay. All right, that was it. Thank you.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you. Jennifer Doherty, Lower Providence. I have a 6th grader and 3rd grader in the district, and I'm a parent on Dr. Harney's Transportation Committee. And a lot of good questions tonight, a lot of stuff to think about. I just wanted to add that I feel strongly, having seen what we went through last year and the challenges we have to fix that for the upcoming school year, that I think one of the keys is time, and giving ourselves enough time to go through the process calmly, make sure we have the best plan. If we don't, if we run into problems like we did this past year, I think one of the biggest problems we ran into was we boxed ourselves in a corner and we had no time to fix the issues as they arose. And what we did to our bus drivers was awful when we got to, they had no time to drive the routes, they had no time to bid on the routes. And I think they're out there in the public a little more and they get more of the blame, and that wasn't fair last year. So I don't know how school consolidation, that timeline fits into this, but I feel like we don't have a lot of time to delay on the busing issue for next year. So thank you for your time.
Anyone else? Can I get a motion to adjourn, please? First, second. All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone.